Anyway, next up we have Kaysa Konopljak, who is a contemporary artist based out of Copenhagen, who works with fan fiction, collective authorship, and against the monopolization of the internet, which is something we're all a fan of here, and does this with performances, lectures, workshop, and writing. She's the proud owner of a Wikipedia scarf, a poorly sat up Raspberry Pi, and 400 hours in Caves of Cut, which is very exciting. So, welcome, Kaysa.
Thank you. Hi.
Cool.
Okay, hello, my name is Kaysa Konopljak. I'm very excited to be here at Roguelike Celebration. I've been an avid follower for a bunch of years, and it's very exciting to be here in a speaking capacity and in such good company as well. It's been really great so far. But we have a lot to cover, so I'll dive right into it, I think. Yeah. Okay, so I'll start with telling you a story, and I'll tell you that story twice in what I hope will suffice for now as a sign of good faith, a declaration where I meet these dynamics I will be talking from, and for a small sense of added drama as well. So we're in 1981, and we're going to meet Doug McRae and Kevin Curran. They are two self-proclaimed hardware geek fans that use their free time on making enhancement kits, which with a more modern vocabulary could be called expansion packs for video games. And they made an enhancement kit for Atari's popular video game Missile Attack. And they called it Super Missile Attack, and that earned them the attention of Atari. But that attention essentially amounted to Atari sending them a cease and desist letter for copyright infringement, which is stressful. They said, stop producing this game. We don't want you producing this. And then they made the counterposition saying, what about you hire us instead? And then that worked somehow. And 2 contracts later, Doug and Kevin were on the legit side of the video game industry. And their first foray into producing legit video games was to improve upon Pac-Man. And they most definitely did improve upon Pac-Man because they made Mrs. Pac-Man, you perhaps know, which now rests comfortably in the hallowed halls of the golden age of video games. So this is a version of the story I'm going to tell I dislike with a passion. I feel it feels a bit dishonest perhaps, and therefore I like viewing Doug and Kevin more as a liberal business entity. And the second iteration of the story I'm going to be telling will be about the ins and outs of the free market and the judicial playing field that comes with it. So, Doug and Kevin had a small business called General Computing Corporation, and they received a routinely cease and desist letter employed by Atari. It's a nice control measure. People stop producing stuff that you don't want them to produce because they get scared. But when faced with this, Doug and Kevin employed the smart counterposition to say, okay, we won't let this go to court if you just hire us. And that's smart because Atari doesn't want this cease and desist letter to go to court because God forbid that they won inside of court. And the reason that would be bad is because if Doug and Kevin won in court, they would not only win for themselves, they would set a precedent. So not only would Doug and Kevin win the right to produce enhancement kits, they would win the right to produce enhancement kits for a lot of other people. So a smart counterposition employed by the smaller company when faced with bankruptcy, a safe bet from Atari, and I dislike this version of the story less. Companies can be cruel, especially when engaging with their copyright, and why not take the money and take the employment? And especially if you don't have the energy or the means to pick the fight in court, and especially the means. But the most important part of the story gets excluded from both of these versions of the story. Because with Mrs. Pac-Man, their first foray into legit game deving, came an anti-code copying encryption device to keep pirates and, yes, modders like Doug and Kevin's former position at bay. So they pulled up the ladder behind them instantly as soon as they got on the legit side of the gaming business. And They not only did this once, because they also patented the anti-code encryption device, anti-code copying encryption device. So they pulled this stunt twice. They doubly pulled up the ladder. Okay, so to get into the meat of what we are going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking about a lawsuit primarily, and we're going to be talking about collective authorship and author erasure in that capacity, in and out of court. And to that end, I'm going to be talking primarily about a lawsuit conducted by DotA, Blizzard and Valve about a DotA copy, an alleged DotA copy that Lilith Games and Ucool made. So DotA, if you don't know, is the original MOBA genre of video games, which was a mod for Warcraft 3 that turned into $1 billion business. And DotA flows in a very similar kind of narrative to Doc and Kevin, but one even more so tainted by sly agreements, corporate bullshit, and legal settlements. So the ins and outs of DotA's development and eventual hyper success has been told time and time again by very talented writers with great articles, but articles that, once again, in my opinion, focuses on the delicious story that this is, and maybe in some ways overlook some of what happens in the wake of a success story like DotA. So I would like to try and dive into the fallout of going legit and forgoing your collectively authored model for one that can make you and your company bank, and how this game, DotA, has been forcibly twisted out of its narrative as a community project. So let's get started. In 2015, Blizzard and Valve sues Lilith Games and Ucool for their alleged DotA copy mobile games. But before we dive into that lawsuit, we need to understand who the main actors of this lawsuit are, how these mega companies, Blizzard and Valve, that are supposed to be competitors, joined forces against Lilith, and what a mastermind is. So we have 4 very important people inside of this lawsuit, our so-called masterminds. And masterminding is a very prominent argument inside of author ownership, legal jargon, in copyright cases in general, and legal language in general. So a mastermind, in the court's definition, is the person to whom the work owes its origin and who superintended the whole work, the mastermind, so to speak. And the 4 masterminds, as declared by Valve and Blizzard, are EOL, Guinsoo, Pendragon, and Icefrog. So let's go through a timeline of these 4 masterminds and DotA. So here we go. In 2002, EOL, also known as Kyle Sommer, starts working on a mod for Warcraft 3 called Defense of the Ancients. In 2003, a version of DotA called DotA All-Stars starts up as a sort of collection of the prominent and popular DotA versions or branches, and later Guinsoo, aka Stephen Feig, takes over on that project. In 2004, EOL makes DotA open source with a forum declaration and forgoes the project. Also in 2004, Pendragon, also known as Steve Mescon, creates a forum called DotAAllstars.com, where a huge community of players and developers of the game exchange ideas, discuss the game, and engage with each other. In 2005, then somebody named Icefrog takes over from Guinsoo on DotA All-Stars. In 2006, Riot Games is founded, and they hire Guinsoo to work on League of Legends. In 2008, Riot hires Pendragon as well as a community manager. In 2009, League of Legends is released. Also in 2009, Valve starts development on Dota 2 and hires Icefrog after his work on Heroes of North. In 2010, Valve hires EOL as well to work on Dota 2, and Pendragon forgoes DotAAllstars.com. And in 2013, Dota 2 is finally released. Okay, that's a lot of information. I'm going to be referring back to the important parts. I know it's a bunch of characters and individuals and names I'm mentioning, but once again, stick with me. I'm going to be mentioning the 4 masterminds a lot throughout. So after this timeline, we have our 4 masterminds. They've done their job, and Valve has hired Icefrog and EOL, and Riot Games has hired Pendragon and Guinsoo. League of Legends and Dota 2 has been released, and the path from mod to $1 billion business has most definitely begun. But how did Valve and Blizzard exactly end up together and stop being adversaries for this? So in 2010, Valve attempted in a common move for them to make a move and acquire DotA as a trademark. It's a common move for them because they did it with Counter-Strike and Team Fortress 2 as well, and then they legitimized those mods, and they brought EOL and IceFrog's rights with them. Later in 2010 then, Guangzhou and Pendragon, the other two masterminds, get very mad at this decision. They think it should belong to the community, and they file a counter trademark. They also try to apply for the DotA trademark. This doesn't stop Valve, so Riot purchases Guangzhou and Pendragon's rights later in 2010. This also doesn't seem to work because Valve doesn't protect their position, and in 2011, Riot then transfers Guangzhou's and Pendragon's rights to Blizzard. And Blizzard finally opposes Valve's application with a formal complaint against their trademark application. Then we don't know what happens. Something goes on behind closed doors. We can only guesstimate so as to what this is, but we know that Blizzard and Valve figured it out, because in 2012, Rob Pardo and Gabe Newell, the former and current CEO of Blizzard and Valve, says, we figured it out. You don't need to worry about it anymore. We're content with how stuff is. Don't ask us anymore. So all is well that ends well, except all is not well that ends well. We're now back in 2015. I've contextualized the timeline a bit for you, and we're back into the lawsuit. Blizzard and Valve are suing for copyright infringement against Lilith Games and Ucool. And Lilith Games and Ucool are contesting this copyright infringement complaint by saying that DotA cannot be owned by Blizzard and Valve. It's a collective work, you shouldn't be able to own it. And now Valve and Blizzard needs to prove them wrong, and in response, Valve assembles the copyright Power Rangers, the 4 masterminds they now have between them, and asks them the very apropos question, did you make DotA? To which the masterminds reply, yeah, we made DotA. And then Valve and Blizzard more or less throw their hands up in the air, so as to say, like, did you hire anybody that sold their rights to you who worked on the game? I don't think so, Lilith Games and Ucool. So the next poignant question for us, and the next important part, is what rights and on what terms are they judged as valid do these 4 masterminds have between them? And I'll try and dive into how Valve and Blizzard construct their claim to ownership when under duress throughout this trial. So throughout the trial, they have a sort of 3-pronged attack or defense, depending on how you look at it, to counter Ucool and Lilith's position of claiming that it's a collective work. And the first is declaring masterminddom. A lot of the work that goes into this lawsuit is done through these masterminds. There's Valve and Blizzard are saying our developers are special. The game couldn't exist without these 4 masterminds. They made it from start to finish, and we could prove a chronological, unbroken line of authorship for these 4 people. The second prong is the discrediting of the community that Ucool and Lilith are saying made the game. Valve and Blizzard are saying, your alleged community doesn't even exist. The community is full of unserious internet people in contrast to our very serious masterminds. And then the third prong is the proof of claim. And that is Ucool is once again saying it was a collective work, and Valve is answering by saying, who specifically said that they made DotA? Because we can't find anybody, and we have 4 people here that says they have made it, and what do you even have in this here situation? So let's dive into how Valve and Blizzard constructs this 3-pronged attack within the lawsuit, and let's start with a quote by Valve's lawyers responding to Ucool calling DotA a collective work that encompasses the entirety of the 3-pronged attack. So, quote from Valve's lawyers. The facts and the law of copyright authorship, arguing that anonymous DotA players and testers who go by internet names such as TerraBlaze, CottonTop, Shadow Penguin, Afro Thunder, and others, while admittedly not authors of the DotA game, may nevertheless be the authors or owners of particular discrete pieces of DotA into which they had input. Specifically, Ucool claims that because these people may have proposed hero concepts or suggestions via instant messages or chat rooms, they own the DotA heroes they suggested suggested or proposed, even though there is no tangible evidence of what their input actually was, and they have never claimed to be owners either of DotA or of the characters they helped ideate. Ukul's claim is unsupported by the law and facts. So we start out with literal name calling in the same breath as upholding UL, Pendragon, and Icerock. They delegitimize the community in a move to attempt to appeal to the legal system's preference towards easy to understand authorship, which is something we will return to in a bit. Simultaneously, they construct an argument around these internet people being ridiculous and unserious with their usernames in opposition to their very serious masterminds. And after delegitimizing their opposers, they drop an important sentence, namely that these unserious internet people didn't claim ownership, in contrast to these two companies' employees, as well as invoking the lack of evidence of these unserious internet people's input, which also will be important later. So there we go, prong 1, 2, and 3, done and done. So let's go back to this preference towards easy to understand authorship that the legal system has. And easy to understand authorship is singular authorship, to be exact. And this preference is littered throughout the thousands of trial papers. And the last argument I just read from you in the quote perhaps reads like some college bro saying, it's just facts and logic, bro. And that is because they're trying to appeal to a system of facts and logic, bro. The legal system simply can't contain any kind of authorship than singular authorship. Quote, taken to its logical end, Ukul's argument would confer tiny pieces of copyright ownership on every person who gave input into content for a novel, motion picture, video game, or other audiovisual work, thereby giving each such person the ability to prevent the true legal author of a work from exploiting or enforcing the copyright in that work. This would include, for example, the Star Wars fan who posts ideas for new alien races on a fan website, the film critic who makes helpful comments to a director about story changes, etc., etc., etc. Meaning, it looks like all they have to do is construct a sound alternative to Ukul's claim that it's a collective work, and then they're set, because it seems like to the court, communal or collective authorship or collective works in general is too much judiciary work. It's too messy to figure out, and they don't want to do it. So they need to lend some credit for their authorship claiming, and who better than your very own employee to lend you his authorship? So now it's onwards for Valve and Blizzard to make the masterminds' claim to DotA watertight, because it isn't right now. Ukul has made some counter-arguments so as to why they shouldn't be able to own DotA through these masterminds. So let's go through them, or go through some of them. So let's start out with EUL. So EUL made DotA originally. So in a sense, he allowed for this whole shebang, both the mod and the billion-dollar industry. But then Ukul's lawyers ask him a question, which is, EUL, didn't you make DotA open source at one point when you stopped developing on the project? To which he answers, yeah, I totally did, but I didn't mean it anyway, so don't you worry. And a thing we need to understand here is, how should this man mean it anyway? He's under an enormous amount of pressure to rebuke his statement. In fact, let's go through some of the pressures he's under. Like, he's in a room with Valve, which has been his employer for 7 years, and it's an intimidating room full of lawyers who wants him to say one specific thing. He will make his sale of his rights and the money he earned from it, and his very reason for employment and Valve, probably, illegitimate in the process. He would bring his own job in jeopardy, and because he would cost Valve tons and tons and tons of money, and they really don't like that. So once again, not to his own fault, he echoes Doug and Kevin. He pulls up the ladder behind him when having the opportunity to stand fast on his claim of open source term. So once again, Valve and Blizzard's lawyers ask their mastermind, did you make the game? The mastermind respond, yes. Check out from EUL. So let's move on to the next one, which is Guangzhou. And Guangzhou made DotA All-Stars approximately at the same time as EUL's open source declaration. And Guangzhou made Dota All-Stars, which is a collection of all of the best parts of the Dota offshoots and the original EUL mod, of course, into a sort of single super strain of Dota, collecting the best ideas of the community in what could be called a sort of collection of Dota hits of the early 2000s. Oh, wait, I think I've heard that phrase before somewhere. Quote, Yukul counters that Dota All-Stars is a collective work because Guangzhou and Icebrook and Mayan and Mad Cow before them took the most popular Dota heroes and arranged them into a new game. But by that logic, Star Wars The Force Awakens would be a collective work because it arranged the most popular Star Wars heroes, settings and one-liners into a new movie. The same might be said of Love Actually, given its all-star cast and web of different storylines, but cast away with its solitary protagonist and even more solitary plot would presumably be a unitary work. None of this can be right, and the Copyright Act does not suggest otherwise. The statute gives a, quote, periodical issue, anthology, and encyclopedia, unquote, as examples of collective works. So someone who, say, downloaded the most popular versions of Dota onto CDs and packaged them as Dota hits of the early 2000s would have created a collective work, provided that the endeavor entailed a minimal degree of creativity. But Dota All-Stars is nothing like that, nor is it anything like the New Yorker, the Beatles Anthology, or Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay, Valve, we get it. You're courting a system that can't hold or can't contain communal authorship, but I'll summon my sense of fairness instead of my very limited understanding of the US legal system for a second and ask, isn't it kind of crazy so few out of literally thousands of people who worked on Star Wars The Force Awakens can be called authors of that movie? But before that, who are Mayan and Mad Cow exactly that just got mentioned in the previous quote? So, quote, at some point in 2003, two still unidentified players who called themselves Mayan and Mad Cow took what they thought were the best, most enjoyable characters from all the other versions of Dota and put them into one mod. They called it Dota All-Stars, and Mayan and Mad Cow's mod was not locked like EUL's, so anyone could build off their code. That feature allowed Stephen Feek, also known as Guangzhou, to transform Dota All-Stars into a Dota superstrain. So Mayan and Mad Cow, these two people that are mentioned in passing, seemingly made the entire groundwork for Dota All-Stars to be possible. So, but the reason these authors are only mentioned in passing is because they didn't claim the video game. So, if ownership is ownership only fencing off your work so you can defend it in court, or should we maybe stop and look for alternatives? If this is the case, the one difference between Mayan and Mad Cow and Guangzhou, other than that they made the game first, which is something the court holds in high regard and not me necessarily, is that they didn't encrypt it. If your system can only hold copyright for the few and influential, and more importantly for those who have the means to enact that ownership and police it, then the tried and true argument for copyright law protecting artists' work doesn't really hold up, does it? And by enact and police, I mean this claiming. This claiming is not free because the other difference between Mayan, Mad Cow and Guangzhou is that Guangzhou is in that room, and by enact and police, I mean this claiming. This claiming is not free because the other difference between Mayan, Mad Cow and Guangzhou is that Guangzhou is in that room full of lawyers, making the expensive groundwork to prove his ownership of the game and counter any arguments made against its legitimacy. The act of claiming is a laborious and extensive and expensive one. Anyway, they've established that Mayan and Mad Cow does not matter and are unserious internet people, and that Guangzhou isn't. Let's move on to the next mastermind. The next mastermind is Pendragon. So Yukul is asking, how can you disregard this massive community? And I don't want to add fuel to an already existing fire that for the best has burned out a long time ago, but I can't ignore that considering the chain of events up till now, Pendragon's deletion of the Dota All-Stars forum seems off. In 2010, the Dota forum got closed for maintenance and replaced with an ad. But it didn't get closed for maintenance. It was down for a full 3 years. effectively deleting the forum, while meanwhile in 2016 Valve and Blizzard keep saying Yukul cannot even produce a single message board or chat log reflecting any of the purported hero concepts on which its argument rests, far less some working version of a hero that existed anywhere other than within the Dota game as an integrated unit. Okay, granted, you could download the forum as an archive throughout the trial, but the community members say Riot deleted hero ideas before re-uploading the community as an archive, and never mind the amount of truth in that statement, because that these questions can even exist is scandalous enough even in and of itself. And never mind this, because there was an alternative made, which is an alternative forum called playdota.com, but you know how it feels to move. It's a hassle and a half, stuff breaks, stuff gets lost, and this is a move where there is no stuff to get lost. There is no stuff to break, because effectively the forum and its contents were deleted. And never mind the allegory of moving, because this is moving thousands of people at once. And they're not moving, they're getting evicted. There are alternatives to these decisions. There always is. You don't need to, and it's also a labor-intensive alternatives you can do, but they're there. And if nothing else, this talks into how once again to go legit had an inherently destructive effect on the community that made going legit possible in the first place. Shedding oneself of one's history so as to be able to stand solely on one's claim to ownership. So, onwards to the conclusion. I've always, in a second-hand kind of way, and perhaps somewhat naively, understood copyright law as a system that enacts protection of ideas if you executed them first. Credit where credit is due, and that sort of thing. But this trial talks into a reality wherein the perhaps most common argument for copyright's existence, namely allowing you to make money off of your hard work, is disingenuous. Throughout this text, I've been torn between two positions to argue from. One position is the wish for a better world wherein authoring functions differently, where inspirations and help is something to be proud of, lifting workloads together and acknowledging collective effort as something special that allows for accumulation of skills and shared expertise, hopefully resulting in culture production becoming more accessible as a whole. And on the other hand, I've been trying to argue against the court's but especially Valve and Blizzard's decisions from a position informed by the former one, sure, but there is and was an inherent pleasure in going through a bunch of legal jargon and realizing that the arguments by which they lift their claim to ownership is faulty. But when you read enough of this stuff, you start to think like them. And when you start to think like them, you start to act like them. And I catch myself trying to discredit them as they have discredited the community. And this is a microcosm of what keeps happening and what the structure around copyright ownership and intellectual property keeps doing to people's work. Articles I read about this trial keeps talking about the importance of receipts and proof of work in a timeline, lest you can end up almost losing your copyright if someone like Yukul and Lilith takes up a fight again. If you need to hold your trade ideas secret and keep detailed filing on who made what when, until one day you can buy a lawyer off in court to demand that you made it because you can prove it, you can end up spending all of your energy engaging in antisocial, anti-collegial, and competitive behavior. But this is not on you. Just as it is not on me for starting to think competitively and argumentatively, or on Doc or Kevin for pulling up the ladder, or EUL for rebuking his statements, or any of the other figures in this trial we have been talking about. Because this behavior is heavily incentivized. These legal structures shapes the kind of arguments for authorship we can make, and this keeping tabs on the approach of what is mine and mine alone works actively against the authorship structures such as the one that allowed for Dota's very existence. The very thing they keep underlining as provable authorship, that is the chronological receipt keeping, can only exist within the authorship structure they prefer to grant. Seemingly as a band-aid for this, the court writes, Yukul asks why Valve should get to capitalize on others' free work. The answer is because Valve, if it prevails, will have proved that it acquired copyrights from people who spent years creating, growing, and yes, masterminding much of the Dota universe. Help along the way does not drain those efforts of their considerable value, and if helpers feel cheated, they may come to court. As if an invitation to come to court if you are one of those alleged community members Valve and Blizzard has worked so hard to dismiss should help, but they may come to court is an invitation underlining this exact systemic bias, because who exactly can come to court? Well, initially it was thought that this trial would go to court, and that a jury would have the final say in if EUL's open source declaration was valid or not. And I realize I'm just about to hit my time. I will be done in a second. If EUL's open source declaration was valid or not, and a bunch of other stuff. But of course, it didn't end like that. It ended in a settlement between the four, because after successfully changing the narrative to be about these four masterminds instead of the community, they couldn't be 100% sure that a jury would believe them. So they shook hands behind closed doors once again out of fear of a precedent-setting lawsuit. The moral being, once again, it ends on a handshake after expensive lawyers did their job. Copyright is not for us. It's for those with means to police it. And that's a lot of means you need, after yelling mine first. And I cannot find a way out of this trial without the only thing I'm being left with is that this is a game of means, a battle of policing. But I digress. This is a talk about the fallout of going legit and cold-hearted legal systems that throws entire communities under the bus for a ton of money. It's a talk about what you can do in the face of this. And in that capacity, I would like to address you, dear roguelike developers. Allowing ourselves to ask questions about the procedure in which ownership is made and allowing ourselves to imagine a better structure for how to protect our art while simultaneously allowing for experimental, involved and communal structures of authorship is adamant. And your work is often slow and caring. Just see the development times for some of your genre's most beloved titles. It's often for free or donation based. You're transparent and generous. You're transparent and generous with your open development, with thorough patch notes and open source code, and with a practice of proudly declaring your inspirations, sometimes even in the name of your game. Look at all the dungeon crawls, as well as generally supporting each other as a community. And exactly this transparency and pride in standing shoulder to shoulder and lending muscles, brains, and labor to each other's as peers and colleagues is one of the best defenses against authorship heists like the one we've gone through today. And the structures that incentivize and instruct it. Especially in procedurally generated media, the circumstances of ownership and authoring when you try to facilitate emergent gameplay and player-driven stories are, well, weird at best. How much do you own a narrative somebody else has pieced together from an experience you facilitated but didn't conduct? Due to this weirdness, I think you've cultivated a unique sensibility on the subject, an awareness and a courtesy I see few places else. And you're doing a very good job of practicing these things. If we hold each other accountable, it will be much more difficult to narrow a narrative in the capacity it was done to this community, because hopefully somebody will speak up and they won't be alone when they do. Today, a lot of the DotA community still remembers EUL, Quinsu, Pendragon, and Ice Rock. And that is a statement you can make about fewer and fewer people as the years go on. But their narrative as main developers and important figures was paid and fought for. I'm trying my best not to diminish what must have been a great big effort on their part, as I'm sure they must have put tons of hours and love and sweat and tears into the game. But I do not think they were the only people who did. It's very nice that we remember these four masterminds for their efforts on DotA, but just try to imagine if we could remember everybody else as well that worked on it. Yeah. That's it. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I was very excited for this talk because I think it is such a celebration of the way that roguelikes have tended to be open and have developed in this way because we've been able to build on each other's work, which is rare in the industry. And I mean, just yesterday we had a talk about the whole lineage of chase-inspired games and how many people have learned to make games and been inspired and by being able to directly access each other's work. So thank you so much. Don't have time for questions.
Thank you.
But hopefully we'll have follow-up in the breakout.